your thoughts? Are you a seasoned remote worker, or are you someone who's kind of learning about it, or actually you thought they were both exactly the same thing? Let's see. Hopefully we'll all be at different kind of starting points from that. So good to see that coming in. We've got a fairly even split, I think, between seasoned remote workers and those just looking to learn and ask questions, hopefully. So as people join, let me kick off with just a very quick bit of sort of context setting. We shared a long form article about the difference between remote working and working from home. And I also included a cricket analogy, which you may or may not have read, may or may not have understood. But basically, cricket, there are different forms of it. You can either play for 3 hours or you can play for 5 days. And just like in cricket, there are different rules that apply to the different formats of the game. There are different skills that people need to be successful. They use different tactics and strategies, and they even play them in different stadiums. So they have different environments as well. So we're going to explore all those differences, but how they relate to remote working. And kind of the key point really is that we need to recognize that remote working is an entirely different way of getting things done. And that's what we see here at Hoxby. So my name is Ben Fuchs. I'm our sort of host today and the lead of our coronavirus, a Remote Against Coronavirus campaign. And I'd like to introduce Alex and Lizzie, our Hoxby co-founders.
Hello, hi everyone. Firstly, show of hands, who already understood the difference between Test match cricket and, is it T20, Ben?
That's it, yeah.
Okay, so I did not understand that. And actually, on reading the full article, Alex and I obviously inputted into it, but when we read the full article, I learned a lot about cricket because I already know a lot about remote working, but I don't know a lot about cricket. So I learned a lot from that. So if you want to learn the difference between those types of cricket, please do read the full article. But today, Ben has been banned from talking about cricket because we want to talk about the difference between working from home and remote working. So just to give a little background on Hoxby, in case you aren't familiar with us. So Hoxby is a purpose-led organisation. So we exist in order to create a happier, more fulfilled society through a world of work without bias. We're a social enterprise and we've been in existence for 5 years, working with 1,000 people working entirely remotely for all of that time. So welcome to our world recently. We are pioneering that world of work without bias with some of the biggest clients in the world. So we deliver projects for the likes of Merck, AIA, Warner Brothers, Unilever, Amazon, etc. And what we do is work flexibly and remotely. And we've been pioneering this way of working and we've been learning from it. And what we found is that this is an opportunity to share our experience with other people.
Yeah, when news of coronavirus broke, it became apparent pretty early on that remote working was going to be a really important part of the solution and the way in which we as humankind combat the virus. And so we started the kind of campaign, a hashtag remote against coronavirus, very early on. And that was before kind of social distancing became the kind of widespread adoption and widespread strategy. But we knew that there was an opportunity to pull together the industry experts, the people who've been working remotely for a long time, behind a single hashtag where they can share advice, tips, information, strategies, and things like that for people who are bound to need it as this pandemic spreads. So that's kind of where the campaign came from. We then wrote an article, a piece around how businesses might want to adopt remote working as the crisis evolves. So through its 4 stages, the kind of government outlined 4 stages of how the country in the UK would respond, but this is mirrored around the world. Those 4 stages are kind of contain, delay, research, and mitigate. Were going to impact businesses. So we wanted to write an article that would help businesses to evolve as that strategy evolved. So we did that, and off the back of that, we created another series of articles to support those stages and the things that businesses are going to need along the way. And these webinars are an opportunity for us to talk about the themes in a bit more depth and for you guys to ask questions. We had the first one last week, which was fantastic. And off the back of that, we're now having further sort of one-to-one conversations with with people who want to understand certain points in a bit more depth, and that of course is available to you guys as well after this, if we don't get into the detail on the topic that you'd really like to. So that's kind of where the campaign came from, and this session hopefully will be exciting. We've got Caroline Aurora joining us this week, who is our personnel director at Hoxby.
Brilliant. So yeah, thanks guys. And so we will split roughly the time just in terms of, we'll bring out some of those key points now, and we're going to pick Caroline and Alex and Lizzie's brain on some of those topics, and then we're going to open the floor to kind of questions. But please, as we go, do type in questions into the chat, and also type in, if you can, some ideas around what comes to mind when you start talking about working from home. What are the negative connotations, the things that we're trying to break with remote working? So, you know, the idea that actually you're spending all day kind of in your pajamas, not really doing any work, is the sort of thing that we're trying to get over at the moment. So Caroline, first thing, you know, Caroline looks after obviously the people team at Hoxby internally, but also works on a lot of our HR projects with clients as well. So Caroline, start us off, the skills that's kind of different with remote working? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, so I think firstly, good morning, good afternoon to everybody that's joined us today. I just nearly had a slip up of the skills that are required to be a remote worker, as my children just brought me lunch into the office that I'm working today. So the first skill I would say is, well, firstly, have children that can bring you lunch, and secondly, make sure the family know when you're working and when you're not. But yeah, welcome to everybody that's joined the webinar today, and thank you for joining us at this kind of unprecedented time around remote working, which has been thrust onto a lot of people that didn't necessarily think about remote working as in their future. At Hoxby, obviously, we are 100% remote community. Personally, I've been a remote worker for nearly 2.5 years now. I'm British, but I live in Barcelona with my family for my husband's job, and so I work entirely remotely. So it has been a choice that I've taken, but I'm really conscious that a lot of people fall into remote working through the current situation that we're in. So I do think there are some differences in the skills that are required to be a remote worker, as opposed to being working in the office or just occasionally working from home on a Friday or whenever. I think one of the first things is around discipline, and having personal discipline and personal leadership of what you're trying to deliver and what you are tasked to deliver. So it's around not having that office environment that says you have to work between these hours. It's around having that personal discipline to understand, this is what I need to deliver. I'm going to be working remotely. I won't have somebody looking over my shoulder, checking what I'm doing, and I have to take ownership and responsibility for my deliverables. So that sense of discipline, I think, is really, really important. The second point is, I think, around self-awareness and building up that skill of reflecting, looking at yourself and figuring out how you work on your own remotely. So I know when I worked in the office, you know, I would work core hours, 9 to 5, as was my contract, probably more 8 to 6. But I know that I'm a morning person. So when I have to reflect on how best I can work, I know that if I get up earlier, I can really smash through my work. But by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that's not my productive time. So having that skill of self-awareness to be able to understand what your style of working is, when you're most productive, and how to get the best outputs from yourself is, again, another skill that I think is really important. The next skill for me would be resilience. This is I will use that this is a marathon, not a sprint analogy, rather than the cricket one, because like Lizzie, I don't know a lot about cricket. But when people work from home, they do the odd day working from home because they've got to get their head down, finish a particularly detailed report, or they've got a delivery, or for whatever reason, they work from home as an exception. But when you're a remote worker, this is the way that you work. It's not a 1 or 2 day thing. And I think that's what a lot of people are realizing. So having that personal resilience to be able to work, motivate yourself, have that discipline, deal with the challenges of connecting with different people in a completely different way is another key skill that I think people need. And then finally, I think it goes without saying that we have to communicate differently in a remote working environment. So if we're not in an office environment, then we can't just turn our chair around and talk to the person that sits behind us. We do have to look at other ways of communicating. So it's building up that skill set and that toolkit to have different ways that you can communicate with people. And at Hoxby, we use Slack as our virtual workplace. All of our meetings are, as we said at the beginning, are video on. So we can always have that face-to-face connection and communication with people. And it's about over communicating and communicating more. And that's what we're finding at Hoxby, is that when we look how many messages are being sent on Slack, Hoxby's are communicating more and more, because even though we're used to remote working, this is remote working to a different level. We can't co-work, we can't get together and, you know, share working spaces. So communication is really, really critical as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caroline. And as you mentioned, please do turn your video on, everyone who's watching, if you can. So based on those differences and those skills, Alex, so what are the kind of behaviors we need to change? What are the rules that we need to change, especially kind of as leaders or people who, you know, run organizations now that are remote working?
I think you mentioned a good point there, Ben, which is about behaviors and us as leaders. I think listening to Caroline talk about the behaviors of a remote worker, I think there's a lot of synergy between remote work capability and leadership capability. So I think a lot of the skills you need to be an effective remote worker are the same as the ones you need to be an effective leader. So I think for people on this call who are already leaders, or if not in title, then in behavior, those skills will already be there for them. But there may be some who are more used to being perhaps more in a kind of traditional hierarchy, told what to do, or perhaps not necessarily in a position of leadership, that might find some of those skills a little bit harder to acquire. So I think thinking about yourself as a leader and a leader of one within your office environment of home is probably quite a good strategy to deploy. But that's not necessarily to answer your question, which is more about the kind of rules that need to change in order to make remote working effective. And I think the difference between working from home and remote working really comes into play here. So if remote working is something that you are adopting as an organization at a total level, it's not something, working from home is probably something that you might allow some people to do for 1 or 2 days here and there. Remote working is more of a kind of organization-wide adoption of something altogether different. And it assumes that you're working from wherever you are. So it takes away the 9 to 5, probably office-based working structure. So I guess the big changes are to remove 9 to 5 working and the office-based structure, so time and place. So I think the rule change around time is about assuming, not that necessarily people will be all working at the same time between 9 and 5 or 8 and 8, as was probably more realistic, but actually that they're going to be working when they can, certainly in the current circumstances, or where they can, or where they choose to, when they want to, when it fits around whatever else they've got going on in life. So the rule change that we adopted at Hoxby was to say, okay, there are no working hours. As an organization, we have no specific working hours. It's up to individuals to decide when they're going to work for themselves. So they have their own work style. And if they want to work from the hours of 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., then that's up to them. That's the big difference, the big kind of rule shift that we think needs to happen with successful remote working. To then look at the other side of it, look at place, so the removal of the office, I think the kind of the change that needs to happen here is to have a single point of communication. So we use Slack as a platform, and one of the things that Lizzie and I did very early on was say, okay, we're going to use Slack. That is the only system that we're going to use for communicating as a group.
No email.
We're not going to, no email. no other systems, so that we don't have fragmentation happening. Everybody knows that we use Slack and that's our single point of reference. So that's the kind of equivalent of an office as a single point of reference. And we found that being strict about that has actually, initially it was quite difficult for people, but it has actually served us really well in giving everybody a kind of a very clear understanding and a consistent understanding of where communication is happening. I think the only other thing with all of this is that there is, with that shift, a change in behavior that's required as well. So you're not working in the same physical environment at the same time as people. And so what you're judging people on needs to change potentially as well. I think there is a unconscious judgment that is that if somebody's in the office, they're working harder, and I'm not going to go into presenteeism and the negative cultural effect of that. But I think what's important is that we recognize that actually what really matters, and the thing that we should be judging people on when they're working remotely, is what they're delivering. So what's the output? This is a meritocratic way of working. It's not about how many hours you put in, and it's not about being visible in the office. It's about what have you delivered tangibly, what's the output, what's the outcome of that work. And that mindset shift, that behavioral shift, is a really important one for really effective remote working to happen.
Brilliant. Guys, we're really interested in your thoughts as well as we're going through this, because like some of these are quite provocative concepts, the idea of not breaking the complete kind of 9 to 5 and the office way of working. So like if you've had practical challenges or questions that you've got about how the implementation of that really worked, please do fire them into the chat and we'll pick them up as we go. But let me just go to Lizzie now to talk about perhaps some of the, some of the benefits, if you like, from implementing some of those rules. And so, what strategies, if you like, then make that, remote working effective, and what have you found from doing that?
Yeah, so I guess there are kind of benefits to the way we work that have also made me seethe slightly during this coronavirus pandemic. So I have been appalled by how many businesses have moved to a working from home mentality rather than a remote working mentality. And by that, what I mean is they have assumed that they will just translate what they do in the office into home. So for example, I've heard anecdotally of a lot of people that have moved from being in back-to-back meetings at the office to being on back-to-back calls at home, which is just not a productive or motivating way to work. And I think when you look at the benefits, if you embrace remote working for what it is and you do it properly, it's highly productive, it's really motivating, it brings diverse teams together who can deliver exceptional work, better work than if you had a less diverse team working together in the same place. So I think for us, there are a few key things to understand that fit with, as Alex said, everything at Hoxby is based on this principle of work style. So you are judged on your output rather than where and when you work. And I think holding work style in your mind is a really important thing in terms of the current situation, because even if people are able to work from home, often there are other factors in their lives, like looking after children or caring for others, that mean that they have to have a bespoke work style. So I think this asynchronous working, so people working where and when they choose, is the most important thing, and that the strategies that underpin that are essentially around having the right methodologies in place and being transparent about them. So having consistent ways of doing things and telling everyone what those are. And there are cultural changes and role modeling needed in order to make sure everyone understands. For instance, we don't use email, and people just don't want to let go of email. We saw that at Hoxby. It took people a while to let go of their beloved email. But if you keep on saying it, eventually you find other people within the community saying, we're not using email anymore. We're using Slack or MS Teams or whatever it might be. Then secondly, communication. So this is quite a big one, and Caroline's obviously already talked about it from a kind of personal skills perspective, but I think from a organizational perspective, it's really important to recognize that transparency is really important. There will be no organic picking up of information. You have to be explicit about everything. And that's an unusual and sometimes uncomfortable situation to get into, because I think it means that you need to spend more time writing things down, making videos, sharing information with people, because you don't have this same organic picking up of information. And also, I think it's something that's actually good behavior for general business delivery, if you're explicit about who needs to do what by when, there's more likelihood it'll be delivered rather than assuming people will pick things up. And I think we talked about trust on our last webinar, so I won't go into too much detail, but I think in terms of the manifestation of that in this particular context about remote working, it is important to assume positive intent, particularly at a time like this. Everyone is trying their best. And, you know, I've been very much in and out of work the last couple of weeks because I've been poorly, and then I've also had one of my children's been really sick with coronavirus too. Not really sick, he's fine. But it's meant that I've been working very differently and had to pull back from some things. And I think assuming positive intent, everyone pulling together makes a big difference when you're working remotely. Sometimes it's best to put these sorts of things in a team charter. So whether it's who's responsible for what, the way things that are delivered, the methodologies that are used. Sometimes, and we shared in the article a link to an example of a team charter that could be a useful framework to put those things down and capture them all in one place. The other big thing that I think is worth mentioning in terms of strategies is that what remote working does is provides a platform for diversity, and diversity drives better solutions, better outcomes, and better business performance. We know that, that's empirically proven. And so remote working is a chance to bring more diverse teams together, because you don't naturally have this bias of who can commute to an office, who can be there between the hours of 9 to 5. Instead, you're looking at people's skills and their passions in order to bring the most powerful, productive team together. So I think that's one of the most exciting things about remote working and the world working this way at the moment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lizzie. And we're going to have our kind of final point to our panelists. Then we're going to start picking up some of your questions and challenges that are kind of coming through in the chat as well. And that's to talk a bit about the environment that we work in now, Caroline. So, you know, how important this is to our mental health and what we can do to help both ourselves and our teams with this. And I think Robin Young's just mentioned in the chat coming through there is, you know, the challenge of our home living space and our situation at the moment. So, you know, even any practical tips around that, I think would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just picking up on a few things that Lizzie just said, you know, in terms of our working environment, to start with, that is Slack at Hoxby, and that purpose of making it as transparent as possible, I think, is so important. The nuances that you might pick up in an office, the way someone says something, the look on their face as they deliver it to you, you lose when you're working remotely because you're behind a screen. And so, you know, and that can make, you know, from a mental health perspective, we need to make sure that we're incredibly conscious of what we say and how we say it when we're just typing it down, especially if we know that, for example, I know one of my colleagues at Hoxby, Victoria, is on the call. She works in the US, I work in Spain. So actually she might pick up a message when it's the middle of my night, although right now it is the middle of her night, which is crazy.
What are you doing up?
But so I think from a mental health perspective, and the environment that we work in remotely, we need to be very conscious of the impact of what we say and how we say it when someone can't read their facial expressions or understand the context from that physical office-based environment that you might have. And I think more broadly, from a mental health perspective, this has been forced on a lot of people that would not have chosen or didn't think that they were going to be working from home. And Alex earlier talked about work style, and that's going to come as a new concept to a lot of people, and especially people like myself that have a family, or people that have caring commitments or other responsibilities that mean in this particular scenario, they're having to juggle what they've got to deliver at work with other commitments in their life that are really critically important. Looking after your children, supporting relatives, caring responsibilities, volunteering responsibilities. So really encouraging people and supporting them to figure out their work style in this specific point in time and what that might look like going forwards. And that can really support people from a mental health perspective, that they feel that they've got ownership and space and responsibility and support to be able to do that. And then Lizzie also mentioned earlier about positive intent. When we're working remotely and we're not physically together, it's such an underlying and fundamental principle to really understand that the intention of people is positive and that we are all trying to muddle through in this way as best we can. And in terms of how we've tried to support our teams with that at Hoxby, we launched in February, before this coronavirus pandemic hit us, we launched wellbeing initiatives across the community, completely remote, completely virtual, using Gmeet and different types of technology to really help people focus on their own individual wellbeing. And what we found was the sessions that were most positively signed up for, and the sessions that people were saying, I really want more of this, were around mental health. They were around mindfulness, guided visualizations, having that time out to really stop and think about what you want for yourself, and that focus and the mental health side of things. And I think that even now, you know, only a month and a half, 2 months on since we ran our first Wellbeing Week, we've now already run another one, which we opened up publicly. And I think it's become so much more prevalent, and people are really accepting that in these exceptional situations, we really do need to put mental health at the forefront of how we're working, the behaviours and the environment that we create at work.
Brilliant. Guys, thanks. And also thank you to everyone sharing questions and things coming through. You've got loads to kind of get through. So let me just pick up a couple now. There's a definite theme around, you know, one of the key things that is clearly coming out is to enable asynchronous work, we have to get away from having this meeting culture, this being on back-to-back calls all the time. How, that's a big challenge though, isn't it? Like, how do we actually change that kind of culture?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the biggest challenges. We talked last time about cultural change as well. And within Hoxby, we talk about the Hoxby model of work, and we have a proprietary model for our future-proofing consultancy business. And there we look at purpose, culture and structure. And I think understanding how those three different elements play an important role is critical at a time like this, particularly in a time when people have a heightened sense of anxiety, and therefore there may be a tendency to shrink back to what we know and think, okay, we're all doing a good job if we're on calls together all the time, which isn't the right way to go. The thing that Alex and I have always said and say throughout Hoxby is, do you need a meeting about this? Do you need a call? If you have a call, make it a video call for a start. We can't say that enough. But also, do you really need to be in touch synchronously about it? Because if you can work separately, you may well be more productive. You'll be able to find a time and a place that suits you better to do it. And you'll also each have the headspace to consider what you're responding. So we are big fans of asynchronous working. We are not fans of meetings. And we would start with a blank sheet of paper and say, assume I have no meetings. What am I going to be missing? And then add them back in rather than automatically starting.
And in fairness, probably because I'm quite new to Hoxby, I'm probably guilty of trying to change this culture myself, because for this webinar, I was trying to, we should have a pre-briefing, and actually we just managed, we recorded a bit of our kind of conversation, so we didn't all have to be on it at the same time. And so actually just as simple as that.
It's weird. People find that weird, don't they? Recording videos.
Yeah, I'm like, oh.
Yeah, and we can use things like Google Docs that we can work whenever we're available, whenever we're able to work. So I know when I'm sharing ideas with different people within Hoxby, I might record a video of myself on my phone for 2 minutes saying what I want to say, because I can speak quicker than I can type. And I'll put it in a Google document. Everyone will comment on it, and then we'll agree it. And we have not had to have a meeting, and we can work across time zones. We can work when works for us, when we're feeling most productive, and we know we can fit that around other things in our lives. And we've eradicated the need for maybe 7 of us to give up 45 minutes of our time to sit in a meeting.
Yeah. So go on, Lizzie.
I was just going to say another word on video. We aren't particularly polished. I don't know if you'll think that from this webinar, but one thing Alex and I early on decided to let go of was spending a lot of time trying to make videos polished. And I don't know if any of you will have seen, but we release a Workstyle Freestyle 2-minute vlog every week, where Alex and I are mostly laughing around, but also making some good points about remote working. And we've tried to let go of our inherent desire to be really polished with everything, and instead just be really open and honest about the challenges and benefits of remote working and some of the tips and tricks that we found through that. And I think that's really important, because in the same way that in an office, people would see who you really are and build a relationship with you, your authentic self, it's important to make sure that through video you do the same and you're not trying to be too polished.
Great. So Nicola, Elizabeth, keep fighting the good fight, keep trying to question those meetings wherever you are. So Ken has a question on, go on, Alex, yeah?
I was just going to say, just at a practical level, you could, if you are struggling to convince the wider populace of the need to stop having back-to-back meetings, you know, as an organisation, you could agree that you have no more than 6 people on any one call, and no call lasts longer than 30 minutes or something like that, which might just help everybody just get into the mindset of, okay, if we need to get together, it only needs to be the people who really need to be there, and it only needs to be for the purpose of making a decision or resolving something that we need to do together, and that doesn't take more than half an hour. If it does, then there's not enough information, or, you know, I think having some very simple rules around the use of video calling can help drive.
I heard actually in Amazon they have like a 5-page shot, so everyone has to already have read the 5 pages before anyone starts talking in a meeting. I think it's just like, because information sharing is not a reason really for a meeting, is it? That's like one of the things I think kind of get into.
Alex and Lindsay as well.
Yeah, so let's pick up Ken's question now. I just want to kind of keep moving forward, because I'm sure we'll get quite a few, which is about experience with sort of remote working activity tracking tools. And this sounds really scary to me. Has anyone had experience with this? Do we have thoughts we want to share on it? Caroline, is it something, do you track all Hoxby's on?
Well, so from a perspective of work style, we do not track in terms of, you know, what time someone logs on and off. What we do track is deliverables and what people deliver to the community. So people that work for a project, for a client project, someone outside of Hoxby or within Hoxby, we record, obviously we track the deliverable we've delivered, and that gets recorded and we get paid accordingly for what you're delivering. But the whole essence of work style is that you do it when, where and how is best and most suited to yourself.
We do use both Basecamp and Monday.com, which as kind of project management tools, but we don't advocate actually tracking when people are working, just because, as Caroline says, that's not what we kind of judge on.
Can I give a perspective on that? Just
please do.
Specific experience. So, hi, it's Ken. I basically worked the whole of last year a contract with a US company with no offices at all. So everybody was a contract, even the CEO was a contractor. And we were working through a platform called Crossover, which is basically an onboarding management platform. But interestingly, it had as part, you all used your own PCs, worked from wherever in the world you wanted to and whenever you wanted to. But it used an app called Crossover, which is basically every 10 minutes, and this is going to scare a lot of people, every 10 minutes it screenshotted your screen and actually took a photo of you, and was also recording keystrokes and mouse clicks. Now that sound, when I took this job, the first thing I did was went and bought another Mac so that I could sort of have, you know, my work Mac and my sort of personal Mac going on side by side. But what I would say after a year of that, or even after a few weeks of that, managing, I was VP of product marketing, had a team, you know, based in Ukraine, Romania, etc., and actually that turned out to be a fantastic experience, because what it made you is, I'm a very self-disciplined and motivated person, but what it made you is think about 10-minute slots of work. So in other words, if I was working in a co-working space, and obviously it's good to have interaction, but if you realize that if you go off and you chat to somebody about, you know, whatever, then you've lost that 10-minute slot, right? And so your 40 hours of work that you were going to do you have to do another time. But it had very positive benefits in terms of it really did make you think, if I want to take a couple of hours off now, I'm not telling anyone. My team didn't need to say, I'm going to go and do this. They just basically worked their 40 hours whenever and wherever they wanted to. And they two of my team moved to Thailand for 3 months. And it was, I can honestly say it was a fantastic experience. And in terms of the tracking, I didn't look at my teams, what they would do.
I was going to ask if you actually had time to look at it, because there's a lot of data to look at. So
yeah,
it's just the psychology of people feeling tracked.
It is. I mean, the company was, to give you an idea, so no offices at all, 70 million turnover, 200 people spread over, we're operating in 50 countries. And all I can say is it genuinely did work. And, it certainly made me think about, creating a startup that actually had a tool like that. And in many respects, obviously, I wish I had, because I think right now with everything that's going on, companies would like to know what people are doing. And all I can say is it started off as oh my goodness, this is a big brother thing. But actually, it was incredibly positive. It probably the most positive experience. And things like bank holidays, for example, I would work a bank holiday, or if I wanted to take a long weekend, I could do 40 hours in 3 or 4 days. And it's very positive. That's what I can say. And not many people.
Perhaps just depends how it's being used and implemented. Perhaps suggests, and whether it's being done with the right intention and the right trust, as it sounds like in your case that kind of was. But and just dissipating the fear of it being misused, or get that information being misinterpreted, even perhaps.
I think it almost like gamifies your kind of, because you think, oh no, I'm going to take a half-hour lunch, or I'm going to take an hour lunch, or whatever, and then you realise you can just, you can make that time up. You can. They actively encourage people to have separate interests, startups, etc. And it was very positive. All I can say.
I think that the interesting point that you're making there, Ken, for me, is that culture. It's a combination of culture and systems again. That in principle, the sound of that system appalls me. Like it's just so different to how Hoxby works, because we just don't. We're the opposite. We just don't even ask where and when people work. We just judge them on their output. But I think it sounds like the culture, whether you or the whole organisation brought to it, was one of trust and as a tool for people to use themselves, so as not to feel guilty when they were switching off or moving to work somewhere else. And I think it goes back to the point that so often in a time of crisis like this, companies are investing in the right structure, the right tech for people, and they probably aren't investing in the right culture. And if you don't have the right culture that goes with it, that's when you can find that productivity and motivation and retention really dip.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Ken. That's really useful. Thanks very much for your question. So Belle has a question about soft and hard deadlines for delivering work, and is it actually better to have in a remote team, perhaps some more soft final deadlines?
I don't think so. Can I chip in on that? Like Caroline's shaking her head as well. I think what we found really interesting is when we first started, we wanted to be completely flexible. Alex and I wanted Hoxby to be the most flexible, no process, no systems. And what we quickly found was you need to put parameters around things. And actually, in this world where everything becomes fluid, it's when you have the right parameters that people can anchor things in certain ways. And so for us, I think it's about having clear final deadlines. That's not to say that you aren't empathetic. I think it's important to understand what people can and can't do, and it's important for people to be transparent when taking things on about what they can and can't do. But whenever we're curating a team to deliver an output, we are really clear on what needs to be delivered when and how much time that will take, so that people can either buddy up with someone else or they won't take on the project if they can't deliver it by the deadline. I would worry that having soft final deadlines would mean that there were too many moving parts and that things simply wouldn't get done.
I think as well, and Am's just raised this point in the chat, which is bang on for me, which is that, remote working works brilliantly in an agile methodology rather than a linear one. So I think wherever possible, adopting kind of agile principles to the way you go about delivering work actually serves everybody much better. You can have kind of shorter term hard deadlines that everybody's working to, and working in sprints and that sort of thing makes things much easier to control. From our experience, that tends to be how we do things as well.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, guys. Thanks very much. Anyone open the floor now, probably to any other questions that we've got. So please feel free to come off mute and ask your question either directly to someone or kind of to the open floor, and we can pick it up. If you'd like to raise your hand or just to come off mute and introduce yourself before you ask a question.
You can raise emoji hand as well.
There's an emoji hand there from Lizzie. And I will try and screen for anyone who is looking out. But I guess if you have your video off, I won't be able to see you. But
just while we're waiting for someone to pluck up the courage to turn off their mute and reveal the fact that their children are running riot in another room behind them, I just want to make a point about the team charter. Somebody's asked if they can see an example of it, and I think a team charter for remote working and or just simply in the face of coronavirus is a really useful thing to do. You'd exercise to go on for an organization, but also for everybody who's in it, a frame of reference for knowing the new rules of the game. So acknowledging that the rules of the game have changed right now, and having a kind of charter for how we're going to behave in these circumstances, I think is a really powerful thing. The charter that we created at Hoxby had behaviours, so things that we all said that we were going to do, but that were linked to our values. And so I think even in a time of crisis like we are now, an organisation can use its values to sort of be the consistent, even though the behaviours are changing. So I think the more that you can stay true to who you are as an organisation, and almost manifest your values through the new behaviours that are required for really good remote working or working through this particular pandemic. I think that's a really good way of kind of constructing a charter that, everybody still subscribes to the same belief system, but understands the nuances and the differences of the way that they need to behave in a day-to-day work environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We did have another question actually about embracing this shift towards Slack, or Teams or whatever the software is, but away from email, and how to actually increase, engagement with that. I've been in environments where Teams is kind of a completely quiet, dead environment. No one does it. How do you actually do it? Was it just the simple as saying as banning it? Other games and things?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. One is if you can make it where it's most fun to engage, then people will naturally gravitate towards it. So at Hoxby, we have a channel called the Water Cooler. It's probably our most active channel, with pictures of cats, dogs, babies, lunch, that sort of thing. So I think then people get in the habit of it. I also think it's about taking the time to embed the right behaviours. So if Alex and I get an email, one of us will reply saying, we don't use email at Hoxby. Let's pick this up in Slack. That takes longer than just replying to the email. But unless you do that, if you do reply to the email, you're basically positively reinforcing the behaviour. So I think as leaders, you need everyone to positively reinforce that and post all their important messages in Slack and have all their engagement in Slack or whatever, MS Teams or whatever the platform is. So we make a point of everything, any big announcement is announced in Slack. And many are only in Slack. We also have a monthly email that we send out, and some things make it into there. But basically, if you aren't in Slack, you're not really part of the Hoxby community, because that is our office and that's where everything happens. All projects are run through there. And I think this goes back to our point about being transparent about what is the tech that we are using, and then really over committing to it. Because I think the other risk is that businesses will introduce MS Teams or Yammer or Slack as an extra, as an on top. And I think that actually in the current pandemic, organizations have started to move more onto those platforms, but not necessarily fully committed to them. And I think testing, you know, Harvard Business Review wrote an article years ago about a project that was run entirely remotely that was far more productive and delivered more efficiently. So I think if companies are even willing to test a couple of projects being delivered through a system like that, then they can use that as a pilot and to showcase that it can be done. And in fact, it's much better to work that way.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lizzie. Someone just asked me privately, but this will be recorded and shared afterwards. So yes, absolutely. If you have kind of colleagues or other people to pass it on to, then fantastic. We will do that. And fantastic to hear that we are influencing the future workforce. As Emily's 7-year-old is listening and is fascinated by this concept. Well,
hello.
When will we go back to the office?
I think they'll be fascinated. Won't they be fascinated by the fact that we ever all piled onto roads and tubes and trains at the same time and went to an office?
Yeah,
particularly with coronavirus, I think for these guys, by the time they enter the workforce, they'll think we were absolutely mad for all working in offices together.
Okay. Any other questions, please? Either type in the chat or please shout out now. How do you manage all interesting question, you know, around information security and privacy in this kind of environment? Yeah, yes, sensitive information, sensitive conversations.
Yeah, our Slack community, there's quite a big onboarding process you need to go through. We have a very tough selection process to get into Hoxby in the first place, but we also then have an onboarding process first in terms of having the right insurance, signing the right associate agreement. And what we do is always use third-party systems that we make sure have the right level of GDPR protection, rather than holding any data themselves. So that's the way that we work. But I would say that, again, this goes, you know, this is the same conversation, data, about confidentiality. And Alex and I have been involved in a number of conversations with clients over the years about confidentiality, that actually they think by having a team that work in an office, that's way better for confidentiality. And we always ask the question, why is it better when people work in an office? They can still go to the pub and tell their friends. Like, actually, it's no different. It's just your perceived kind of traditional mentality of confidentiality or whatever. So this is as much about having the right mindset and being tight on due diligence around security of information and on confidentiality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would just add to that I think over the last 5 years of running Hoxby and building it as an entirely online business, one of the things that we've had to do is build more rigor around our processes and our data handling. And I'd say that we are much tighter as a business digitally than we ever would have been had we had a physical office where information can go astray. Quite simply, within our digital ecosystem, everything is traceable, everything is connected, and then the network of systems makes that, I think, more robust, as well as giving us, you know, useful data. So I think, you know, there's benefits to having that, you know, a more conscious construction around how you handle information, which is what we have now.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks. Belle Wilson, would you like to? Do you have a question?
Hi everybody. Yes, I got a question. Okay, I'm a creative, and the problem I have with all this remote work is that presenting ideas and presenting work, creative work, is super hard over Zoom, over anything. It's very difficult to do the job justice. And I just was wondering if you have maybe some advice. And another thing is, like, as well, for me, is that when you present creative work to clients, you almost need to kind of warn them that, you know, it's going to be messy, it's going to be, you know, it's not going to be as organized as when I present in front of the client in a room, and I have my boards and I have my, you know. So yeah, just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
So my personal view on that is, and I think one of the skills that we're all learning quite quickly is the ability to record our screens and record videos for one another. I don't know whether you're doing this within your organisations, but certainly at Hoxby, it's something we do quite regularly, which is to create a presentation and then film ourselves talking it through. So we have almost like a guided presentation that kind of draws the person who's going to watch it to the key points or to some of the sort of the things that you might mention in a normal presentation. So we would kind of pre-record that and then share it, and either separately or as part of a conversation like this, a live conversation like this, we could still show it as a separate video. So I think learning the skills to create really good sort of not instructional videos, but almost presentation videos is an important emerging skill and an emerging requirement for working in this way. I think it's something that we're all going to get better at, I think, in the not too distant future.
Mm-hmm. Useful tip there, Belle. Thanks for your question. That's great. Just on those skills as well, Elizabeth is raising, the question of self-discipline, and I think also I could probably say even more broadly, how do you develop some of those skills, that's Caroline, that we were talking about earlier? How do you help those individuals who aren't used to that way of working? Is there anything in particular you could advise?
Yeah, I think, in some ways, being a remote worker for a longer period of time and through choice, for me, I've had the time and the space to be able to, like, through trial and error, work out, what my work style is and how it works best for me. But I know that one of the things that Alex and Lizzie have spoken about is around setting your work style and really putting out a blank sheet of paper and setting down, these are the 7 days of the week, these are the 24 hours a day, what are the things that I need to do, as in sleep, or eat, or look after the family, etc. And then mapping out when your chunks of work are within that. And then that can be, that instead of having the 9 to 5 rhythm that you might have in an office and knowing, okay, the canteen opens at 12 and I'll go off to the canteen for my hour and come back, you then have that structure around your day in a remote working environment, and it then fits your work style rather than the office prescribed hours that you should work. So I personally find that a really good way of, visually seeing, this is how I'm going to set myself up, and holding myself accountable to it. And I think that is one of the skills that we talked about right at the start of the session today, which is around really having to take that disciplined approach with yourself and having to take that ownership, which in a lot of traditional workplaces is seen as the leader's job, is to get you to work in that way. But when you work remotely, you have to take more of that responsibility and discipline on yourself, I think.
Great. And I can probably attest to that as someone who is perhaps not historically always been the most self-disciplined person, but I found actually just writing down and estimating how long each task takes, probably a bit like to Ken's point, when you start breaking down your own day into chunks of time, you suddenly go, I'm actually wildly optimistic about what I'm going to get done this week. Because I actually don't have much time, because I was planning to do this that afternoon, this that other time. And so once you actually get a bit more granular, and then holding people to account, maybe, we've launched the remoteworkmates.com thing, but it's actually also finding someone, even if it's not your boss, to just check in. I live with my partner, but actually it's really helpful just to say, what are we going to do? What are you going to achieve today? What have you got on today? And it helps just in that way.
Another big help is just the sentiment of this session, which is for people to not think of themselves as working from home, but think of themselves as a remote worker, and think of yourself as a remote worker. And suddenly you think, okay, that might feel a bit uncomfortable, but therein lies the challenge to adopt the skills and the things and the self-discipline that you need. So I think subtle reframing of kind of your circumstances and who you are right now is helpful too.
And share that video on, Alex and I did a kind of teach-in as part of our Public Wellbeing Week on how to set, project and respect your own work style, which I think is more important now than ever. And as Ben said, remoteworkmates.com, we set up a public community in order to buddy experienced remote workers with more novice remote workers, because sharing your work style and having a buddy to help check in and hold you to account on that is a great way of learning and making sure you're true to your own work style at a time like this.
Yeah, and I also think emotional intelligence skills more generally, as a number of these things are, whether it's communication, self-awareness, resilience, they're just a super important skill set now to have, in the world of work, probably even beforehand, but even more so now in a world of kind of remote working. So I'd be looking at what courses you can do, because those things are also available kind of more generally, and certainly flowering, I think, in the kind of learning and development space now. So guys, thanks so much. If there's any last questions, please fire them in the channel. But what I'd like to do just for the last 5 minutes is ask our wonderful panelists and our guests here to share their one more practical kind of key takeaway that they want you to leave this webinar remembering before we close up. So who should we pick on first? He's looking like least nervous. Lizzie's got a nervousness on there. There we go. Lizzie, would you like to share
I'll go. So mine, because we're all going to say work style, because it's all about work style. Work style is the thing that changes everything. For me, it would be, don't just sit on meetings and calls all day. It will add to everyone's stress. You won't get any actual work done. And if you can be the person within your organisation that inspires change to move away from just working from home and to true remote working, then that can leave a lasting legacy for the good in any organisation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lizzie. Alex, are you?
Yeah, I can go. So I think working from home implies that that's an important part of how you should be judged, with the fact that you're at home, when actually that is completely irrelevant. I think you need to judge yourself and the people you work with on their output. And that should be the thing that everybody takes away from this. It doesn't matter when or where the work gets done. What matters is what that work is.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. And Caroline, thank you for joining.
I couldn't agree more with Alex and Lizzie with their sort of closing comments, but I think for me as well, it's around recognising that there are different skills that are going to enable remote working, and it's having that self-awareness of what those skills are and giving people the support and the encouragement and the space to be able to find their own work styles and figure it out how to remote work in this new and different environment.
Brilliant. Guys, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, everyone for giving kind of an hour of your time. Please do follow us all across social media. Our Remote Against Coronavirus campaign is still going along there. We will also, if you've had questions and things, follow up individually to really get into a bit more detail. It's really interesting. We love hearing your views as well about the challenges you're facing and how we can help. Next week, we've got another one of these sessions, and we're going to focus more in on the virtual communities. So originally came from, we were being asked about how would you do events, but actually we said, well, why are you hosting kind of a big group of people together in the first place? Virtual communities building is kind of actually what we should be thinking about in this post-corona, if you like, world at the moment, and how we've done that within Hoxby. So it should be a really interesting session. We'll have a couple of new guests for you there. Check out our blog for all of the latest thinking, and we will follow up with some kind of links to useful materials and things that we've been developing. But thank you guys, thanks for joining, and hopefully see you all next week. And we'll share the link for you to share with your colleagues and other people if you found it useful.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks everyone.